Hi, I'm Eldrick Stoneskin, and the video essay that you're about to watch is part one of a series containing my theory surrounding the secret of the Winterfell Crypts, and ultimately the key to defending humanity against the coming onslaught of the others. As we look through A Song of Ice and Fire, the statues of the Kings of Winter are very clearly and very heavily foreshadowed to come to life, as we are about to see. And after following this line of investigation thoroughly, I'm more sure than ever that we will see stone beings rising from beneath Winterfell. I believe that behind the infamously collapsed section in the lowest depths of the crypts, the first Kings of Winter, the heroes of the first long night, still sit their thrones, both alive and dead at their post, their bodies turned to stone as a means of magical protection to fight the others, and as a means of preserving their bodies for thousands of years while they sit their dark thrones, awaiting the call to rise again, harder and stronger. And while this may seem outlandish at first, just remember that George has placed a disease in this universe that will turn you to stone. So make sure you like and subscribe, and come with me as we enter the crypts to uncover the truth of these stone kings of winter. Almost all the language surrounding the Stone Kings of the Crypts anthropomorphises them. George is constantly describing them as though they are sat frozen in stone, alive but inanimate, awaiting resurrection. And some of the best examples of this are while we are down in the crypts with Ned and Robert in a Game of Thrones. We hear that the Lords of Winterfell watched them pass. They are then described as sitting in long rows with blind eyes staring out into eternal darkness. We hear that the shifting shadows made the stone figures seem to stir as the living passed by. We hear that Ned's brother Brandon is sat with quiet dignity, stone fingers holding tight to the sword across his lap. Perhaps the most obvious is when Robert's eyes lingered on Lyanna's face as if he could will her back to life. And a few moments later, when he touched her cheek, his fingers brushing across the rough stone as gently as if it were living flesh. If that's not enough, we hear once again that blind stone eyes seem to follow them as they passed. That all around them, the dead of Winterfell seemed to watch with cold and disapproving eyes. And at the very end of the chapter, Ned could feel the eyes of the dead. They were all listening, he knew, and winter was coming. So as you can see, the foreshadowing for these Stark kings sitting frozen in stone, awaiting resurrection, in one of the first chapters of the series, is quite heavy and should imply its significance. And as we move forward through the books, the foreshadowing just keeps on coming. While Ned is dreaming, he notices that the Kings of Winter watched him pass, and the direwolves at their feet turn their great stone heads and snarled. As he progresses through this dream, he gets to the tomb where his father slept, with Brandon and Lyanna beside him, and dreams that Lyanna's statue whispers to him. John also sees similar events while he dreams of the crypts too, when he notes that their grey granite eyes turned to follow him as he passed, and their grey granite fingers tightened on the hilts of the rusted swords upon their laps. And later in the same chapter, we hear that the Stone Kings were growling at him with granite tongues. In fact, we even see the kings rise from the grave in one of John's reoccurring crypt dreams when, in the dark, he'd heard the scrape of stone on stone. When he turned, he saw that the vaults were opening, one after the other, as the dead kings came stumbling from their cold black graves. Even Theon can feel these kings watching him when he takes Lady Dustin down to the crypts. He mentions that he could feel the Stone Kings staring down at him with their stone eyes, stone fingers curled around the hilts of rusted long swords. As a quick side note, notice how it says that the Stone Kings are staring down at him. Well, we should also note that these kings are seated, and to be looking down on someone while sitting, well, this would have to make them giant in size. And to top it all off, while Bran hides down in the crypts, it seems to him, when Osha lights a torch, that the dead were rising as well. To be honest, it's actually quite hard to find a quote about these giant stone kings that doesn't symbolise them as living beings, sitting sentinel, frozen in stone, awaiting reanimation. And to further this foreshadowing, it seems George may be using some clever descriptive language each time we enter the crypts to hint towards a stone army residing down in the depths of Winterfell. When we enter the crypts with Robert and Ned in A Game of Thrones, we hear that flickering light touched the stones underfoot and brushed against a long procession of granite pillars that marched ahead, 2 by 2, into the dark, turning the stone pillars of the crypts into an animated stone army marching towards the darkness. Then, in A Dance with Dragons, when Theon leads Barbary Dustin down into the crypts, we hear that he pushed the door open and led them out into a long vaulted tunnel where mighty granite pillars marched 2 by 2 into blackness, symbolically giving us yet another animated stone army marching into the dark. And to hammer this home, we see this same language used while Bran is in the crypts in A Game of Thrones, when he describes Maester Luwin as striding briskly down the vault past the procession of stone pillars and the endless carved figures. In my opinion, this repetitive militaristic symbolism is George's clever way of foreshadowing an army of stone Starks rising from the crypts, ready to march into the darkness of the long night. But what's interesting is that we don't just find reanimated stone symbolism in the Stark statues, we also find it in their descendants, the current members of House Stark. Our first example is Sansa Stark, who is reborn as Elaine Stone, who, after Ned has been arrested for treason, thinks to herself on 2 separate occasions that the people of King's Landing avoided her as if she had the Grey Plague, a disease that turns people to stone. She also imagines her skin turning to porcelain, to ivory, to steel, as if she is becoming a statue during her escape from King's Landing. And she repeatedly tells herself that she must become Elaine Stone inside and out, suggesting her turning to stone once again. Next is Catelyn Stark, who dies and is resurrected as Lady Stoneheart. We also have Arya Stark, who was a dead girl in various ways, and a repeated part of her mantra is to stay still as stone. Rickon Stark is believed to be dead but is in fact alive and living with the Stoneborn. Bran Stark is also considered dead but is actually alive as well, and we hear a story of Maester Luwin making a statue of Bran out of clay in a story Bran recalls in A Game of Thrones. And Jon Snow is set to be resurrected, and he just so happens to be near a disease foreshadowed to awaken that turns people to stone. In addition to these resurrected stone Starks, if we look at the Stark bloodline and their renowned genetic characteristics, we see even more stone symbolism surrounding their lineage. Catelyn recalls Ned's brother Brandon as looking at her with the cool grey eyes of a Stark, telling us that grey eyes are a strong genetic feature of the Starks. This is further corroborated when we hear that Arya had her father's eyes, the grey eyes of the Starks. Catelyn even recalls Ned as having dark grey eyes, eyes that could be as soft as fog or hard as stone, giving us stone symbolism in this genetic trait of the Starks. We also hear Bran think that Jon's eyes were a grey so dark they seemed almost black, but there was little they did not see, bringing to mind the language around the ever-watchful eyes of the Stone Kings. But even more interesting is that the stony grey Stark attributes are not just limited to their eyes. Theon thinks to himself after the abuse that he suffered at the hands of Ramsay that his hair was white and thin and his flesh had an old man's greyish undertone. A Stark at last, he thought, suggesting that a known and common genetic trait of the Starks is to have grey eyes and grey skin, almost as if they themselves are symbolically stone as well. The Starks follow this grey theme so much, it's a part of their sigil, the Grey Direwolf, and is also the name of one of their cadet branches, the Grey Starks. In fact, the other cadet branch of House Stark, The Karstarks are interesting too, as the Proto-Indo-European root meaning of Kar is hard, effectively giving us more evidence of hard Starks. To further this, while down in the crypts with Bran, Maester Luwin describes these ancient Starks as hard men for a hard time, in an amazing example of George's clever wordplay. In Ned's first chapter, he also tells us that the Lords of Winterfell had been men hard as the land they ruled. While Bran is travelling backwards through Stark history in his Weirwood vision, he describes all the Lords and Kings of Winter he sees as tall and hard as well. Bran even sees Jon, our next King of Winter, growing cold and hard at the wall in his fly or die dream. An amazing choice of words for someone who could potentially contract Greyscale in the winds of winter. In fact, there's almost too many references to the ancient Stark kings as being hard people to count, which is not only a way of describing them as tough and unrelenting people, but I think is also a clever and subtle way of George alluding to them having literally been turned to stone. And finally, the inclusion of Ned's mother's mother as a flint only further associates the Stark lineage with stone genetics, with a flint being a type of stone used to strike fires, with their sigil being that of a stone hand, reminding us of Greyscale and the methods used to halt its progression. And just quickly before we move on, Bran describes his father as looming over him like a giant in this very first chapter of A Game of Thrones, symbolically painting the Lord of Winterfell as a giant, just as we heard the statues were giant as well. So by all accounts, the signature Stark look is that of grey skin and grey eyes, and by placing symbolic stone ancestry in their lineage through the Karstarks and House Flint, we might be looking at the fact that House Stark may literally have stone in their bloodline from ancient times. But not only do we get resurrected stone Starks and resurrected stone kings, if we take a look at the castle of Winterfell itself, we once again see more of the same. In Catelyn's second chapter of A Game of Thrones, she thinks of Winterfell as having scalding waters rushing through its walls and chambers like blood through a man's body. And while Jon is adjusting to life at Castle Black, he also thinks of Winterfell in this exact same anthropomorphized language that Catelyn does, symbolically showing us the castle of Winterfell as a giant stone man. And if this stone giant has blood pumping through its veins, as both Cat and Jon say, it must have a heart, right? Well, it does. It has a heart tree, meaning it's almost as if its weirwood is the most vital part of the castle, the part that gives life to this giant stone man. The castle itself is further implied as living when it's described as growing like some monstrous stone tree, once again drawing a connection between the castle of Winterfell and its weirwood, while also giving the castle life again by describing it as growing. We also get this reference to Winterfell being a symbolic stone warrior by giving the castle a beard and a weapon in A Dance with Dragons, when it's noted by Theon that icicles long as lances hung from the battlements, fringing the towers like an old man's stiff white whiskers. We also see that while under the control of the Boltons, Winterfell feels like it has a life of its own. The castle is constantly thought of as being filled with ghosts, with Theon repeatedly thinking that there are ghosts in Winterfell, and I am one of them. And with mysterious murders occurring around the castle, and an intense snowstorm seemingly emanating from within, it feels like this giant stone man has come to life to extract revenge against those who wrongly inhabit it. And finally, we even see parts of the castle literally come to life in Bran's dreams, where he witnesses the stone gargoyles that sit atop the first keep pull themselves loose from the stone and pad down the side of the tower. No matter which way you look at it, the castle of Winterfell feels alive. And by repeatedly anthropomorphizing this giant stone castle, I think George is complementing the foreshadowing around the giant stone warriors of the crypts returning to life. And to further this theory, When we look at the heart tree within Winterfell's Godswood, we see more of the same language repeated. In A Clash of Kings, when Tyrion recalls Winterfell and its Godswood, he describes its heart tree as standing like some pale giant, frozen in time. Theon also thinks of this same heart tree as a pale giant with a carved face and leaves like bloody hands. We also hear Bran recall that the Winterfell heart tree has roots as thick around as a giant's leg, giving us several references to this weirwood as a giant anthropomorphized being. And knowing that weirwoods never die, they just turn to stone, this frozen giant becomes just like the Kings of Winter beneath it and the castle that surrounds it, a giant anthropomorphized stone being frozen in time. In addition to this, the trees in Winterfell's Godswood surrounding this frozen being are often described in very militant terms, just like the procession of stone pillars in the crypts we discussed earlier. George uses specific language to describe these trees, naming them such things as soldier pines and sentinels armoured in their grey-green needles. Theon even goes as far as thinking of them as symbolic soldiers in A Dance with Dragons, noting that a warm fog hung in the air, turning the trees into sentinels, tall soldiers shrouded in cloaks of gloom, symbolically giving us giant warriors arising from within the Godswood. So what could all this mean? We have resurrected stone people from a giant anthropomorphized stone castle, worshipping a giant anthropomorphized stone tree, while giant anthropomorphized stone kings sit frozen in time beneath them. With all the extremely heavy foreshadowing that the Stone Kings of Winter will rise, the symbolic stone army George is presenting beneath the earth, and the fact that the current Starks are shown as resurrected stone people as well, this is where my theory comes in. Perhaps the Stark custom of creating a statue of their dead is a misunderstood echo of a much more ancient and magical tradition. What if the Starks' ancient ancestors, the first Kings of Winter, were literally turned to stone? During A Dance with Dragons, while Lady Dustin is speaking with Theon, we hear that somewhere beneath us are the crypts where the old Stark kings sit in darkness. And we find that same language repeated when Bran recalls that there are deeper levels where kings more ancient still sat their dark thrones. Which is interesting because the language frames these statements as if they are still sitting there after all these years. We also find out that the deeper the level, the more ancient the king, meaning the lowest level must have the oldest Kings of Winter, the first person or people to end winter and found Winterfell, the same people we think would turn to stone. It's also hinted that ancient men may have been larger and would be considered giant by modern Westerosi standards. We hear that the Great Barrow is said to be the grave of the first king of the first men in Westeros, and it just might be that this king was giant, as some argue that it must be some king of the giants who was buried there to account for its size. This is also furthered when we hear from Jon that, in Old Nan's stories, giants were outsized men who lived in colossal castles, fought with huge swords, and walked about in boots a boy could hide in, sounding remarkably like the first Kings of Winter, whose ancestral sword Ice is considered a giant sword as well, and if I'm right, are living beneath a colossal castle to this day. And it would be great if we could go down and investigate these giant stone kings, but conveniently, it turns out that the lowest level is partially collapsed. Now, with the crypts having been built by Bran the Builder, whose other works around Westeros have stood the test of time and is considered widely to be of legendary quality and strength, I don't think this level has collapsed due to age or construction, meaning this lowest level was probably collapsed deliberately, most likely to conceal the very first Kings of Winter. And the reason might be that these first kings aren't just statues, but 8,000-year-old warriors turned to stone, seated on weirwood thrones, both alive and dead at their post, swords drawn across their laps, ready to rise again harder and stronger to defend humanity from the devastation of the others once again. Hence why we see foreshadowing of the statues reanimating, so much resurrected stone symbolism around the Starks themselves, the castle of Winterfell being presented as a living stone giant, and the weirwood giving us more of the same. To further this, after Winterfell has been put to the torch, Bran thinks to himself that the roots of the trees go deep, and under the ground, the kings of winter sit their thrones. So long as those remained, Winterfell remained. Which is interesting, because even though the castle of Winterfell, the ancestral home of House Stark and the only home Bran has ever known, is broken and burnt, he feels confident that the heart and soul of Winterfell survives, telling me that the true purpose of Winterfell is dependent on only two things: the weirwood containing spirits above, and the stone kings foreshadowed to reanimate below. Which leads me to believe that Winterfell's true purpose is in fact an ancient defensive weapon against the others that the North was supposed to remember. So here's what I think happened thousands of years ago. The first Stark and his followers swore an oath to the weirwoods to gain the magic of the children, forming the first Night's Watch by being sacrificed and resurrected in front of the Winterfell heart tree to save the realms of men. Their skin changer spirits slipped into the weirwood as their throats were slit, and their bodies were then blessed with stone. These Night's Watch brothers were then resurrected back into their stone bodies, now undead and invulnerable, rising again literally harder and stronger as a means of physical protection against the others. And after the war for the dawn is won and the long night is over, their skin changer spirits slip back into the weirwoods so their stone bodies could be stored in a purpose-built crypt, allowing these kings of winter, these stone knights watchmen, to fight in this night and all the nights to come. If this is the case, and an ancient Stark had his throat slit in front of the Winterfell heart tree, it just might be that we have already witnessed this magical ritual taking place. In Bran's weirwood vision during a dance with dragons, he seems to be glimpsing into the past through the eyes of the weirwood, progressing further and further back through time, right to the origin of the Winterfell heart tree. During this vision, Bran mentions seeing the tall and hard kings of winter that he remembers from the statues in the crypts, until it all seems to culminate in this final scene of a person who is an early Stark being sacrificed to the weirwood. The interesting part of this scene is that the ancient Starks were skin changers and greenseers, which tells us more about this sacrifice than we think. As I think a key part of the sacrifice ritual was being a skin changer or greenseer, so they can slip into the weirwood as their throat is slit, allowing them to be resurrected back into their bodies, just as is theorised to happen with Jon after having his throat slit, with his spirit slipping into Ghost, who by no coincidence has the red and white colouring of a weirwood. We know this is possible as we see it in the prologue of A Dance with Dragons, with Varamir's spirit passing into the weirwood after attempting to body snatch Thistle, witnessing his own dead body on the floor, and Thistle, comparable to the weirwood woman in Bran's vision, dancing underneath a moon in agony while his spirit is inhabiting the weirwood, which compares well to the constant references to the moon showing the passage of time in Bran's weirwood vision chapter, as well as the weirwood woman's sickle blade, a sickle being crescent or moon-shaped as well. But I think the reason George is connecting these two scenes is to show us that skin changers and greenseers could skin change and live out their second life in a weirwood as they die, which I believe George is alluding to in the name weirwood, with weir meaning man in Old English, making the weirwoods half man, half tree, in the same way a werewolf is a half man, half wolf. And I believe it was this ritual that Bran witnesses of an ancient Stark being sacrificed that allowed them to enter the tree so their bodies could be turned to stone and stored for thousands of years behind the collapsed wall in the Winterfell crypts, preserving them and hiding their existence until the next long night. And George may be hinting that this is indeed the case with this interesting quote from a Ned chapter in A Game of Thrones. While Ned is looking for Catelyn, who has just arrived in King's Landing, He thinks to himself about the trials the Stark family have just been through on the road here, telling himself that the Starks must have a frozen hell reserved for them, which compares well to the idea of them being frozen in stone, deep in the symbolic underworld of the Winterfell Crypts, where the Starks actually do have a place reserved for them. Ned then goes into a sunken courtyard and passes some old suits of armour, which George presents as anthropomorphised sentinels yet again, bringing to mind the crypts and the Stone Kings of Winter sitting sentinel, watching from their walls. We then hear Littlefinger, whose family sigil is that of a stone giant, joke that Ned Stark is about to have his throat slit and his body stored behind a wall beneath the earth, just as I'm suggesting happened to the very first Stark and his companions, the sacrificed stone heroes behind the collapsed wall of the crypts. And by placing this idea of slitting a Stark's throat and sealing him up behind a wall to exist in a frozen hell reserved for them, next to deliberately placed anthropomorphised statues, I think this is yet again more evidence for our theory. Littlefinger then says that Ned's wife awaits, who eventually, after becoming Lady Stoneheart, parallels Thistle as they both rake and claw their face in agony and end up silent, and also parallels the Weirwood woman of the last scene with her white hair, who slit a Stark's throat, just as Littlefinger suggests is about to happen to Ned when meeting his wife. And in my eyes, this scene is meant to inform us of what happened in that magic ritual that created these Stone Kings of Winter, their throats slit and their stone corpses sealed behind a wall, making them eternal, undead and invulnerable stone warriors, the perfect weapon to defend the realms of men and win the battle for the dawn. And in my opinion, George is creatively drawing on real-world mythology and his favourite works of fiction to inspire and create these stone warriors of the crypts. These Stone Kings foreshadowed to wake would be George's version of the dead men of Dunharrow from The Lord of the Rings, who are spirits of ancient kings sat in limbo, awaiting to fulfill their vow and awaken for battle, combined with the terracotta warriors of real-world China, who are an army of stone warriors prepared for battle beneath the ground, with the spirits of the dead residing in the Weirwoods, being reborn into their stone bodies beneath the ground to rise again in defence of man. And to keep going with this idea that George likes to creatively draw on real-world mythology to inspire the world and lore of his The Song of Ice and Fire universe, it seems being stoneborn is a common and reoccurring trope in real-world mythology. And it just so happens George included an ancient northern culture that would date back to the Long Night that call themselves the Stoneborn. The Scogosi are an ancient northern civilization which has been isolated geographically from modern Westerosi culture for thousands of years, creating an interesting cultural time capsule that has likely preserved memories, stories and traditions from potentially as early as the Long Night, and this culture has interestingly named itself the Stoneborn. These Stoneborn are described as a savage group of people who still speak the old tongue, an ancient and largely forgotten language, and are said to be descendant from giants. They still worship the old gods and even offer sacrifices to their weirwoods. They even partake in cannibalism, a practice that is theorised to awaken the gifts of greenseers and may have been commonplace in ancient First Man culture. These Stoneborn are also said to reside underground, just like our Stone Kings in the crypts. We even see a Stark going there, with Rickon being taken by Osha to seek refuge, hinting at some association between the Starks and the Stoneborn. George even cleverly describes Skagos as a stark and forbidding land, potentially hinting at a Stark connection yet again. And it just so happens the Scogosi have also been connected to the Night's Watch by George, with one rising to position of Lord Commander and another having been made First Ranger in the past. All in all, this land and its people have roots that most likely extend all the way back to the Long Night, hence why naming themselves the Stoneborn is so interesting, potentially hinting at their ancestors literally being born from stone, just as we think the first Starks may have been. Which leaves me to wonder if the Starks and the Scargosi are both descendant from the ancient stone heroes of the first long night that we believe are residing beneath Winterfell. And if we look further into this motif of being stoneborn, when we look to real-world mythology, there is one religious deity that may have inspired George to create these stone Stark heroes. If we look to the mythology of Mithras, we find it shares many parallels with our stone kings of the Long Night's Watch. We find that followers of Mithraic religion would gather in caves or subterranean temples, just like we see the stone kings beneath the earth in the crypts. And only men were allowed to join this brotherhood, just as the Night's Watch only allows men to join, and the crypts traditionally only have statues of kings as well. We even see this Mithraic brotherhood performing death and resurrection rituals, exactly as I'm suggesting the first kings of winter partook in. But most interestingly, we find out that Mithras was said to have been born of stone and is regarded as a bringer of light, or put another way, a light bringer. Just as we think our stone kings beneath Winterfell are a weapon against the others, making them a stone-born version of Lightbringer as well. Which is interesting to hear when researching the trope of being stone-born, because when we look into Lightbringer, and therefore Azor Ahai, it's very evident that there are a lot of parallels between Azor Ahai and these stone-born kings of winter, potentially hinting that Azor Ahai himself became one of these stone kings. As I've already displayed, the Stone Kings are consistently associated with fighting the others and watching for the onset of winter, just as the Night's Watch does and Azor Ahai would have. We also know that the crown of the Kings of Winter is made from iron and bronze, which are said to be the metals of winter, dark and strong to fight against the cold. And with a title like the Kings of Winter and naming their castle Winterfell, we can also assume that these ancient Starks were the ones to defeat the last long night and raise their home on the site where winter fell. And if Azor Ahai is said to have conquered winter, and therefore the long night, he could very well be one of our Kings of Winter, which makes sense as we see Jon being both the next Azor Ahai and a new King of Winter. To further this idea, we hear in the world of Ice and Fire that one of Azor Ahai's other known names is Eldrick Shadowchaser, which to me is a remarkably Stark-like Westerosi name. In fact, we consistently see naming variants of Eldrick within House Stark itself, with names such as Elric and Edric in their family line, hinting at this Eldrick Shadowchaser connection. The name Eldrick also happens to be of Germanic origin and means old wise ruler, which is a pretty fitting name for an ancient Greenseer king such as our Kings of Winter. And it just so happens that one of our Stone Kings in the crypt is named by Bran as King Edric, showing us a Stone King remarkably close to the Westerosi name of the hero of the Long Night, Azor Ahai. And if this Eldrick Shadowchaser was turned to stone in order to defeat the others, then an appropriate title would be Eldrick Stoneskin, the ancient Stone King beneath Winterfell. We also see that just like Azor Ahai's sword was broken and the last hero's sword was broken, the Stark ancestral sword Ice is also broken during the events of A Song of Ice and Fire. And when Ice is broken in two and becomes Oathkeeper and Widow's Wail, they become red swords after Tobo Mott's attempt to colour them. These swords also receive rubies in the hilt after Tywin says that garnets lack the fire of rubies, associating the Stark ancestral sword Ice with the red sword of heroes Lightbringer, the sword that Azor Ahai is always associated with. We even see the two swords catch on fire in one of Jaime's dreams as he and Brienne use the red swords to drive back the darkness as they light with pale fire, connecting the ancestral Stark sword Ice to the flaming sword of heroes Lightbringer once again. And if Azor Ahai is one of the Stone Starks foreshadowed to awaken, The prophecy that Azor Ahai shall be born again makes perfect sense. In fact, when we hear of Beniro speaking of Dany as Azor Ahai, it's mentioned that death itself will bend its knee, and all those who die fighting in her cause shall be reborn, furthering the idea that warriors of Azor Ahai will defy death and be resurrected to fight again, just like our Stone Kings are foreshadowed to do. So with the Stone Kings of Winter showing us all these parallels with Azor Ahai, while they sit frozen in stone, heavily foreshadowed to reanimate, it might well be that Azor Ahai is one of our ancient Starks who was turned to stone and is now awaiting resurrection. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. As you can see, there are some strong hints at the Kings of Winter having been sacrificed and turned to stone so they may reawaken once more. And I think this ability was the key to turning the tides for the realms of men. And as we know, there is a tale of a northern hero who gained an unknown magic that did just this. In part 2, we're going to look at the last hero and his companions, the magic he was said to have gained from the Children of the Forest, the forming of the Night's Watch, and the resurrection and stone symbolism surrounding them all. I'd also love to discuss your thoughts, ideas, or additional evidence around this theory in the comments below. Thanks very much for watching. I'm Eldrick Stoneskin, and I will see you next time.